Hi, it's Mary.
Hey, Mary.
G'day.
Got Mary and Deb
Yep.
today.
Oh, there's Tanya.
Hi, everybody. We'll get started. I'll give one more minute to allow now people to join in.
So how many people are joining in, Tanya?
I actually don't know, Mary, but at the moment we have quite a few. You should be able to see them all coming up in your, if you scroll along your screen.
Yep. Yep, there are 19 already.
Thanks, Jenna. 21. That's great. Yeah, it's very misty on the mountain here.
And cold.
Cold. Look, I don't know why I have to just talk about it. I'll show you.
Yep, looks misty.
Misty on the ferns. All right, everybody, I might just get underway now. Good morning and welcome. This is Gender Equity Victoria's first Zoom press conference. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. It's not just one land, it's multiple lands. It's incredibly significant that we're all meeting on multiple lands. We acknowledge that all of those lands were never ceded. Today, over 50 organisations, and I have to say to you that the endorsements are coming thick and fast, who are committed to gender equity, have signed on to a joint statement calling on governments at both the state and federal level to acknowledge and act to support the unique ways that the pandemic is affecting women and gender diverse people. I think the most critical way that we've seen this is that in gendered work that has traditionally been low paid and insecure, we are now seeing all of these jobs are now an essential part of the pandemic response, whether it is in nursing and medical roles, family violence support, teachers, early childhood educators, even retail, the much maligned checkout chicks. These roles that women have been performing for a very long time and that were often undervalued are now fundamental to keeping us well, healthy and safe. And we want to acknowledge and say that we see those women and we want government to see those women. We see what the challenges and difficulties that those women are facing in their workplaces, at home, with the additional extra care burdens that they now have, both in terms of education, but also in running their house. And we also acknowledge that many of them are performing other care responsibilities in the community for parents, ageing and disabled loved ones. We know this work. We know how fundamental it is a part of women's lives. We recognise that juggle struggle. And in a pandemic, all of those problems are as exponential as the virus itself. Today, I won't read every part of the statement because that will have been sent through to you. Have you all got that, or would it be helpful for me to read it out. I just don't want to waste time today because I know our time is precious, but there is a full statement which you can read in terms of the narrative. We also have a series of 10 things that we want governments to do. And I did want to read out those 10 things for you because I think that they are important. So if I could begin by letting you know that we are really keen to see government fund gender and disaster workers. And just to briefly explain what that means, we need gender and disaster workers who are focused on bringing attention to violence prevention initiatives, wellbeing responses, and building community connectedness at a local level. And you will hear from Dr. Deb Parkinson, who has been leading the gender and disaster work across the state of Victoria since Black Saturday. We have world-leading gender and disaster workers and a program here in Victoria, and we need that to be rolled out, and Deb will talk to you more about that. We need protection for obstetrics, gynecological, sexual and reproductive health services. We need assurance that COVID-19 contamination is not going to take place in all of those places where women specifically need protection. We need a boost to family violence prevention and response activities to cope with what we know will be increased demand and support in the community. We already know that there's a 70% traffic increase on Google for domestic violence. This is a risk of violence that increases because of social isolation, but it is also a risk of severity too. We are looking also for COVID-19 communications and data gathering to apply a gender lens. It's not good enough if the data is coming out without acknowledging what the sex disaggregated and gender disaggregated impacts are. And we don't just mean for single cohorts of women. We want to know we want an intersectional analysis. So we want to know how the virus is impacting on cohorts of Indigenous women, women with disabilities, women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, what is happening in rural and regional locations. And we want government to be keeping and reporting on that data now. We also want the communications we want to assure the communications is delivered in multilingual ways. We have been concerned at the front, particularly early on in the pandemic, that the comms were not being delivered in ways that were really reaching multicultural communities, and that worried us considerably. Wage subsidies for all workers. Women are the majority of our precarious workforce, full-time, part-time, casual, limited tenure, contractor, gig economy. We want wage subsidies for all of those workers. And we also note that many of those workers are being stood down right now without the job seeker wage subsidy coming into effect. So this is going to need to be addressed in further stimulus packages. We want recognition and support for carers and educators at home. And you'll hear from Mary Crooks, the CEO of Victorian Women's Trust, about what that really means shortly. We are looking for women essential service workers, and we don't just mean nurses and doctors. We are talking about childhood educators, teachers, aged care workers, disability, mental health, frontline family violence case managers and refuge workers to have personal protective equipment. They are performing risky work. They really are at the front line, and it's just not a good thing to see these gendered professions without access to masks and gloves. We also think that there should be an essential service bonus as part of further stimulus packages. We're looking for essential service workers who cannot stay home and are looking after us to get free childcare. We think the country deserves to do that for this workforce. Our second last request is that all of the decision making regarding pandemic response and recovery needs to be gender equal. We are looking for pandemic stand down task forces or any kind of government decision making that is going to be prioritising investment, services and infrastructure to get this to get the state and country back on its feet to have gender equality. And finally, I'll say it's about money. So we are also looking for gender equal investment. We really need to ensure that the recovery and the response is benefiting women, men and gender diverse people equally. And we know from past budget cycles at a state and federal level that that's often not the case, and that there will be considerable amount of jockeying about the budget and how it's going to impact on various communities, what it's going to deliver and who is going to benefit. And we want to ensure that we get gender equality investment back on track as we're getting the rest of the state and the country back on track. So that's it from me. We'll be hearing from Mary Crooks now, and then Deb Parkinson, and then there'll be an opportunity for some questions. Mary, you need to unmute. Yep, great.
I know, I'm channeling Hamlet, to be or not to be, to mute or not to mute. Thanks, Tanya. And look, congratulations for taking this initiative. It's just so important that women and women's organisations can come together, not just today, but over the weeks and months ahead. So well done for being able to provide a platform for that. Look, I think I'm probably telling you what you all know, but let's just actually put together in economic terms the kind of burden that women have been carrying for a long time, let alone now. So we know about the enormity of women's unpaid work in the home. We know that people around the world have tried to count that and put a dollar value on it, led by women such as Marilyn Waring. We know that countries would not be able to afford to pay for the work that women do in their homes because it's too great. It's too great in dollar terms. It would be up there around 50% of GDP. But that means that we shouldn't keep discounting the value of the work that women do. My analogy is this: if the Westgate Bridge collapsed tomorrow, there would be traffic snarls for weeks, there would be infrastructural solutions, there'd be new traffic management plans, and ultimately it would be rectified. But if the work that women do in maintaining household functionality, if that work was taken out of the picture, society would in fact collapse. That's how significant the work is that women do in the household sector. But it's been consistently ignored, it's consistently been marginalised. And it's something I think that we as women, we've got to put a stake in the ground at this time and say, enough of that. We have to start recognising in material terms what it is that women are doing to keep households running and to keep households functioning as cohesively as possible. But apart from the unpaid work that women do in households, they do most of the care work within households and within families. So that they are doing the care work around children. They're more likely to be the ones that are caring for members of their family or friends of family away from the home as well. And that's unremunerated and usually unrecognised. So apart from the fact that they're doing the unpaid work at home, most of it, and they're likely to be doing most of the care work within a home and within a family, they're also, if they're in paid work, working in sectors that are more casualised, that are lower paid, from teaching through to nursing, aged care, and so on in the hospitality industry. So already we've got a triple whammy for women. They're not paid for the work they do at home, they're not paid for the care work they do at home or in families, and they're not paid well in the work that they do out in the broader economy. Add to that the fact that 1 in 3 Australian women has no superannuation at all. And the ones that do have superannuation, collectively, it comes in at about the average balance of a woman's superannuation holding is about 50% that of men. So it's constituting an accumulative burden for women that often goes without enough recognition from the people who are holding the policy levers in our economy and society. What it means as a general rule is that women, more than men, are likely to experience a much higher level of economic insecurity and economic precariousness. And this helps explain why more women are now drifting into homelessness in the latter part of their life, because we're saying to them, thanks women for all of the work that you've done at home and in your families and all your care work. And now if you want to drift into homelessness, well, we're sorry that that's happening to you. This accumulative economic burden of being unremunerated in terms of paid and unpaid work, this accumulative burden then has the overlay of violence and gendered abuse that I think at the moment is such a cause of grief, not simply for those women who are trapped in homes, in abusive relationships and can't necessarily do anything much right now. They can't even necessarily make a phone call to Safe Steps or some organisation. But it's a cause of immense grief. But we have to make it clear, we have to drive a stake in the ground here that women's economic security is also overlain by many women in terms of living with abuse within those household parts of our society. So I think that the kind of actions that Tanya has outlined in the paper, I'm especially interested in us making a call for some material recognition allowance paid quarterly, for example, to all the women in this country who are looking after kids, who are looking after family members. I've done a little quick back of the envelope calculation that $7,500, for instance, to every woman in the country who is engaged in that work in 3 quarterly payments at the time of this crisis comes in at a little over $1 billion. Frankly, in the scheme of things, it's peanuts, but it would be a real start. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you, Mary. Considering that Victoria's GDP alone of unpaid care work is valued at 205 billion, it's peanuts. Peanuts. Deb, can I invite you to address our meeting today?
Yes, thanks, Tanya. Thanks for coming along, everyone. I'd like to just pick up on Mary's point about increased domestic violence within the home. And it's been a real shift for me to look at what's been happening. It seems that there's a general willingness to agree that this is likely to happen and is in fact happening, which is different to what's happened in the past. The other thing I've noticed is the link to our bushfire research, where we were the first ones to identify that link between bushfires and increased domestic violence. The circumstances are very similar. For example, you have that environment of increased pressure, layer upon layer of pressure, unemployment, lost income through financial losses, the stock market and so on. You have grief and loss, you have overcrowding, you can have homelessness for some people. For women, for example, who are in a domestic violence situation, it's really hard at any time to get emergency accommodation. But in this COVID-19 context, you know, it's an extra complication that makes it so that women are preferring to stay at home, which is nothing new to any of us. What's interesting about our research is that women told us and men told us the key thing was gendered implications. It was about expectations of men, and the expectations of them were to fulfill that hegemonic role, that ideal masculine role of being strong and silent, being a protector, a provider. And none of that was particularly possible in the bushfires and after the bushfires. And it's certainly the same now. The difference is that it's more widespread. It's actually an urban issue as well as mostly rural areas that were affected by bushfire and other disasters. So we're noticing that men have felt that they were failures in the bushfires. Their whole sense of identity as a man was lost through that loss of control. And loss of control, fear, all add into them trying to regain their sense of who they are, the sense of being a man. And they often take on hyper-masculine and violent actions to do that. For women, the gendered expectation is, as always, to put their own needs last behind those of their husband or partner, behind those of their children. And that goes even to the extent of putting up with violence against them. And it seemed, in the bushfires that women's right to safety took a second place to looking after men who were suffering. And I can see in this COVID-19 situation is possibly not the same to that heroic level, but it's still the case that we look at men as the head of the household and that what they say has to go, and women's autonomy is really not there, particularly with the 24-hour surveillance that Mary mentioned. What concerns me at the moment in particular is the women and children in East Gippsland. Attention has really gone off that circumstance, yet their situation is even worse than that facing people after Black Saturday. So I'd really like some attention to that. In 6 months, we'll be in another fire season. In 6 months, we don't know if coronavirus is going to be a thing of the past. In fact, it looks like it will still be very much with us. So I think our attention needs to be on that. And it also needs to be on that higher level pulling back of women's rights. We know that patriarchy takes opportunities where they can. Crises are a big opportunity to claw back all the gains that women's rights have achieved over the years. We've seen it happen in the United States with abortion clinics being closed, in the UK with the monitoring of the pay gap being stopped. And I think that we need to keep a close eye on what's happening at that bigger level as well.
Thank you so much, Deb. I'm actually going to see if hopefully I can do this, but I might not be able to. I'm going to see if I can now unmute everybody. Maybe I might ask my gender equity colleague, who I think is hosting this, if they do that for us. Yes, I think that's happening now, or if you can do that yourself. And open it up to some questions of the panellists today. If you've got some questions about the statement or anything that has been raised by myself, Mary or Deb, please just shout out your name and ask away. Oh, don't go shy on me. So Jenna's got a question. She's asked Deb, can you tell me if you have any data yet on what is going on with COVID-19?
No, I don't have data, but there's an article in The Guardian that's just come out today, and it's talking about data in other countries, and there's hard data from China saying that there's about 3 times the rate of domestic violence, 90% of which is because of COVID-19. Well, we know that it's not actually because of that, but there's a link to that. And it talks about data in Spain. It talks about the first homicide of a woman in front of her children on the 19th of March, Valencia, in the context of the COVID-19 shutdown. There's also data from Italy and the UK. So as far as I know, we don't have any data in Australia yet, but it was interesting to see, I think, Mary, you mentioned about Scott Morrison saying, oh no, it was you, Tanya, 75% of Google's, there was an increase of Google searches by 75% looking at domestic violence help. So I think that's a really interesting statistic.
Any other questions?
Yeah, it's Sian from ABC Central Victoria. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can,
Yep.
Sian. Nice to be with
Okay,
you.
great. Look, I just wanted to put forward the question to you. Why would this be of benefit to the state government and the federal government at the moment when their priorities are focused on specifically stopping or flattening the curve? What would be your argument to them to raise this as a priority and put it up there at the top of their to-do, so to speak?
Well, I think if I could just answer that briefly, I think that first of all, a number of the recommendations in here go to the response itself. So our concerns about the failure to provide PPE equipment to industries that are outside of the medical and nursing profession. Clearly, in a number of spaces right now, economic stimulus packages are being developed right now, and they're being delivered not necessarily with the gender lens. So, you know, not including casual workers who have got 12 months or less experience or connection to the workplace. Who does that impact? It's going to impact on women who have who've returned to the workforce after caring for children. Every economic decision that is going to be made about COVID-19, as it is every time there's a decision about the way in which we spend money or invest our money, is going to require a gender lens. And we are asking for gender equality to not be an afterthought. It can't be an afterthought, not when you're expecting women to perform the high level work that they are currently doing at the front line of the entire disaster. And these organisations and myself are not going to accept that.
Yeah, if I could add to that, there's a concept of the tyranny of the urgent. So under this concept of we can't talk about gender, we've got an emergency on our hands, that's the excuse, and it is an excuse. Why do we ask women to give up their right to human rights? We don't ask anybody else in our community to give it up. Even the sense of democracy, I notice there's talk of having a special group of High Court judges to oversee what the government is doing, as they do in New Zealand. So we're really keen to preserve some rights. Why not women's rights?
So in terms of the voice, I guess, I mean, I think what you're doing personally is a really great thing, and we should have it there. But in terms of the voice that you have and putting the 10 recommendations in front of Parliament or in front of government, do you have an advocate that will be doing that on your behalf?
So Gender Equity Victoria is the peak organisation for gender equity, violence prevention and women's health across the state. We will be presenting this joint statement to the Prime Minister, the Premier and the relevant health and women's ministers. So in that sense, the advocacy will continue very much from our organisation. We're deeply committed to advancing the principles that are set out in the statement. But judging from the reaction that we have had to the statement, there's clearly a huge desire from a number of organisations to make sure that women are seen and that the incredible role that they're playing now is seen, and that the way in which we are tailoring our policy and investment responses are going to be addressing their needs and as much as the needs of business and men.
Tanya, it's Mary, could I respond also to Sian's first question?
Of course.
Sian, I think the real paradox here is that for decades, for generations, the work that women have done in their homes and in their families and local communities has been rendered invisible, and it has been discounted, and it's not been part of the policy prism through which our parliaments, which have been largely male dominated, that it's not their policy prism. But it happens, and it's a crucial component of the way our society ticks over day after day. I would say that the question of recovery, for instance, from COVID, that we will make a better recovery as a nation if we are able to, in some way, recognise and strengthen and support the roles that women play day after day in homes, looking after kids, and so on. So recovery, if we looked after what women do, we will have a better chance of recovery in the medium to the long term. If we continue to ignore it and think that, oh, that's just over there, a side issue of gender equality, then we're actually ignoring the vital role that women play that is invisible, tends to be discounted. But that my point was that if we want to see social dislocation, if we want to see hardship and a breakdown in family structures and the ability of families to come through this, then we do that at our peril if we discount the vital need to support women through this crisis. To me, it's not so much a question about safeguarding women's human rights. Pragmatically, it's about doing the right thing by women now, because it will benefit everybody in the short to medium term.
Yeah, I thank you, Mary, for that contribution.
Thank you.
And sorry, Tanya, sorry, could I, just one afterthought to that around the issue of violence. We know, you know what, we know that the hard data, when it comes in, will show us that there has been a spike already, and there will be a continued spike over the months to come. We know that from the work that Deborah and others have done, that after every disaster, whether it's floods or whether it's bushfires, there's a spike. So that's not going to magically become something else. What we also have to think about is not simply on the impacts of women who will be now living in tight, close quarters in abusive relationships, but what we also have to think about is there will be thousands of Australian kids now over the weeks and months to come who will be witnessing at close quarters on an enhanced scale violence in that household, and they'll come out of the crisis in the medium to long term severely traumatised. So this is not simply an issue about women in abusive relationships, is that there will be significant populations of Australian boys and girls who come out of this over the months deeply scarred.
Thank you, Mary. Any other questions? Mary. Any other questions, team?
Actually, this is for Mary. It's Sian again. Sorry. This is around the figure of $7,000 per basically woman working in a field of care, whether home looking after children or looking after elderly or people with disability. How did you come to that figure of $7,000 as a rough estimate?
By applying a little intelligence lens. My point, Sian, is that I mean it's a very modest it's a very modest contribution in dollar terms, but what it would do, you've got to find a sweet spot between something that isn't a huge drain on the economy, something that would be more a psychological recognition for women to feel that they are supported and acknowledged, and it would give them a little bit of a hand on the home front to weather the crisis and the extra costs that the burden that they're shouldering. What I'd love to do, you see, is then have the mandarins in Treasury, state and federal, start to pick up on even the principle and the concept, and then they can do some figure work. My point is that the people who are holding the levers of policy don't even tend to think like this. My point is start to think like this, because it's in the nation's interest to start to think like this.
Great, thank you for explaining that.
Sian, can I also draw your attention to a Deloitte's report from 2019, so it's very recent, which quantified the value of unpaid labour in Victoria at $205 billion. So that's half of the state's GDP. And that's just Victoria. So the costings that Mary has done compared to that figure is incredibly modest if you were going to do that for the nation.
Great. Thank you very much for explaining that. Appreciate it.
Okay, I'll ask one more time. Are there any other questions from the group? Okay, no, thank you very much. Thanks so much for joining us today. I can let you know that we will be attaching that statement to our website, and we have shared that around in the chat if you haven't seen it, but it will be in our media release and on the front page of our website if you would like to access that. That's www.genvic.org.au. We are happy to have conversations, ongoing conversations across the day, and feel free to get in contact with us. The details are on the bottom of the press release. Thank you so much for joining us today in our first ever Zoom press conference, and please go forward and share these principles with as many organisations and individuals as you can. We'll be sharing it on social media and updating our list of endorsed organisations as we go along. So there are a number of entities that didn't meet our deadline, and so we'll be adding to them as we go. Thank you very much, Mary and Deborah. We really appreciate your contributions today.